On the 18th day of March, 1915, the entire Ottoman Empire stood on the brink of dissolution. In Constantinople, government officials hastily packed archives and gold onto trains heading east. Wealthy families fled the city, and somewhere in the ancient waters of the Dardanelles Strait, a small Turkish minelayer named Nusret had done something that would change the course of history, though no one knew it yet. The Allied fleet, the most powerful naval armada ever assembled in Mediterranean waters, was about to give up. And the tragedy was this: the door was open. The Turks were beaten. They simply did not know it. This is the story of how Winston Churchill staked his entire political career on a single audacious gamble, a plan to end the deadlock of the Great War by smashing through the Dardanelles, capturing Constantinople, and knocking Turkey out of the conflict. It is a story of breathtaking ambition, catastrophic miscalculation, and one of history's most heartbreaking what-ifs. Because the evidence suggests that on that fateful afternoon, with 3 battleships sinking beneath the gray Aegean waters, the Allies were closer to victory than anyone realized. To understand how Winston Churchill arrived at this moment of supreme crisis, we must go back to the winter of 1914. The war that everyone had expected to be over by Christmas had instead frozen into a nightmare. From the English Channel to the Swiss frontier, 700 kilometers of trenches scarred the earth of France and Belgium. Britain and France had already suffered nearly 1 million casualties in 4 months of fighting. Young men were dying by the thousands to capture a few hundred yards of churned mud. And there seemed to be no end in sight. Churchill, at 40 years old, was First Lord of the Admiralty, the political head of the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. He was brilliant, restless, and utterly frustrated. The Royal Navy, that instrument of British imperial power, sat in its bases at Scapa Flow and Rosyth, watching and waiting for a German high seas fleet that refused to come out and fight. Churchill wrote to Prime Minister Herbert Asquith in late December, "Are there not other alternatives than sending our armies to chew barbed wire in Flanders? Cannot the power of the Navy be brought more directly to bear upon the enemy?" His gaze turned eastward to a narrow strait of water that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, the Dardanelles. This ancient waterway where Xerxes had crossed into Europe and Byron had swum from Europe to Asia was just 38 miles long. At its narrowest point, called the Narrows, it squeezed down to barely a mile across. And it was the key to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which had entered the war on Germany's side in October 1914. The strategic prize was enormous. If the Allies could force the Dardanelles with their battleships, they could steam into the Sea of Marmara, appear before the walls of Constantinople, and compel the Turks to surrender. This would knock an entire nation out of the war. It would open a warm water supply route to Russia, whose armies were starving for ammunition and whose economy was being strangled by the closure of the Black Sea trade routes. It might convince the wavering Balkan states, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, to join the Allied cause, and it would free British and French resources for the decisive theater in France. On January 2, 1915, Churchill received the catalyst he needed. Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia sent an urgent appeal to London, begging for a British demonstration against Turkey to relieve pressure on Russian forces in the Caucasus. Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, passed the message to Churchill with a crucial addendum. Any such demonstration could not use ground troops, because none could be spared from the Western Front. Whatever Britain did, it would have to be done with ships alone. The next day, January 3rd, Churchill sent a fateful telegram to Vice Admiral Sackville Carden, commander of the British Mediterranean Squadron. The message was direct. "Do you consider the forcing of the Dardanelles by ships alone a practicable operation?" Churchill added a phrase that would later haunt him: "Importance of results would justify severe loss." 2 days later, Carden's reply arrived. "I do not consider Dardanelles can be rushed," the admiral wrote. "They might be forced by extended operations with a large number of ships." Churchill later described those 4 words, "they might be forced," as the crucial turning point. Here was a professional naval officer, a man who knew the Dardanelles intimately, saying that the operation was feasible. Churchill seized upon this assessment like a man grasping a lifeline. Within days, Carden had developed a detailed plan. The operation would proceed in stages. First, the destruction of the outer forts guarding the entrance to the strait. Second, the sweeping of the minefields while suppressing the intermediate defenses. And third, the systematic reduction of the powerful forts at the Narrows, followed by the fleet's triumphant passage to Constantinople. Carden requested a force of 12 battleships, 3 battle cruisers, numerous cruisers and destroyers, and a flotilla of minesweepers. He estimated the operation might take about a month. On January 13th, Churchill presented Carden's plan to the War Council. The effect was electric. Cabinet Secretary Maurice Hankey recorded that the idea caught on at once. After months of bloody futility on the Western Front, here was a vision of decisive action, of war-winning strategy, of a way out of the nightmare. Lloyd George declared that he liked the plan. Kitchener said it was worth trying. Every member of the War Council was enthusiastic. The resolution was passed unanimously. What no one in that room fully grasped was the enormity of what they were proposing. Ships would attempt to force a heavily fortified strait against prepared defenses, something that had been considered impossible by naval experts for decades. The mines, the shore batteries, the mobile howitzers, the treacherous currents, all of these obstacles would have to be overcome by naval power alone, without a single soldier setting foot on the hostile shores. Churchill himself had written a cabinet paper in 1911 arguing that the days of forcing the Dardanelles were over. But the war had brought many surprises. Belgian fortresses thought to be impregnable had fallen in days to German artillery. Perhaps the same could be achieved here. Yet even as the War Council gave its approval, there were shadows of doubt. Admiral Sir John Fisher, the 73-year-old First Sea Lord and the architect of Britain's modern navy, had deep reservations. On the morning of January 28th, before the final War Council meeting, Fisher attempted to resign. He met privately with Asquith, expressed his concerns, but found the Prime Minister unreceptive. After a long conversation with Churchill, Fisher relented and went further, adding the brand-new super-dreadnought HMS Queen Elizabeth with her devastating 15-inch guns to the force assigned to the operation. It was a fateful decision. Fisher's silence at the War Council, his failure to voice his professional objections openly, would later be condemned as a dereliction of duty. But in that moment, the operation had the apparent support of the entire British war leadership. The bombardment began on February 19, 1915. The Allied fleet, now swelled to 18 battleships plus supporting vessels, opened fire on the outer forts at the entrance to the Dardanelles. The results were encouraging. Turkish guns were silenced, fortifications damaged, and by early March, landing parties had gone ashore to complete the destruction of abandoned positions. Carden sent Churchill an optimistic message on March 4th. The fleet could expect to reach Constantinople within 14 days. But beneath this optimism, a deeper problem was emerging. The minefields could not be cleared. The minesweepers, converted fishing trawlers crewed by civilians, were unable to work under the fire of Turkish mobile howitzers hidden along the shores. Night after night, the trawlers attempted to sweep the mines, and night after night they were driven back by the flickering searchlights and the crash of Turkish shells. The crews simply refused to work under such conditions, and no one could blame them. Without clearing the mines, the battleships could not advance, and without the battleships suppressing the shore guns, the minesweepers could not work. It was a deadly impasse. Then, on March 15th, Admiral Carden collapsed. The strain of command, the sleepless nights, the mounting pressure from London had taken their toll. His medical officer diagnosed him on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Command passed immediately to his deputy, Rear Admiral John de Robeck, a capable officer who had privately harbored doubts about the operation from the beginning. De Robeck was determined to launch the main assault as soon as possible. The date was set, March 18th. What de Robeck did not know, what no one in the Allied fleet knew, was that 10 days earlier a small Turkish minelayer had fundamentally altered the battlefield. The Nusret, under Lieutenant Commander Haki Bey, had slipped down the strait on the night of March 7th and laid 26 mines in Erenköy Bay along the Asian shore. Unlike the main minefields, which stretched across the strait, these mines were laid parallel to the coast, precisely in the area where Allied ships turned to port when withdrawing from bombardment positions. The location had been carefully chosen by Turkish observers who had noted this pattern of maneuver over weeks of fighting. British reconnaissance aircraft had swept the area on March 16th and 17th. They found nothing. The mines lay waiting, invisible beneath the clear blue water. At dawn on March 18th, the Allied fleet weighed anchor at the island of Tenedos and steamed toward the Dardanelles. The day was fine, visibility excellent. De Robeck's plan was methodical. The battleships would advance in three lines, with the French squadron leading, followed by British ships. They would silence the Turkish forts at the Narrows, allowing minesweepers to clear a path, and then the fleet would force the passage. By the following day, they expected to be in the Sea of Marmara, steaming toward Constantinople. Shortly after 11 o'clock that morning, the first British line opened fire from Erinköy Bay at a range of 12 kilometers. The great guns of HMS Queen Elizabeth hurled their 15-inch shells toward the distant Turkish fortifications. The roar was tremendous, the explosions cataclysmic. Turkish return fire was scattered and ineffective. By noon, de Robeck ordered the French squadron to pass through and close on the Narrows forts. The battleships Bouvet, Gaulois, Suffren, and Charlemagne steamed forward, their guns blazing. For a time, it seemed as though Churchill's gamble might pay off. The Turkish forts fell silent one by one as their guns were damaged or their crews driven to shelter. An Ottoman account later recorded that by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all telephone wires were cut, all communications with the forts were interrupted, some of the guns had been knocked out. The defenders were being overwhelmed. At his headquarters in Constantinople, War Minister Enver Pasha waited anxiously for news, while Ottoman officials prepared for the worst. Then, at 6 minutes before 2 o'clock, the French battleship Bouvet swung to starboard into Erinköy Bay, beginning her turn to withdraw and allow fresh ships to take her place in the firing line. Without warning, she struck one of Nusret's mines. The explosion tore through her hull. Within seconds, the great ship heeled over, capsized, and sank. The entire sequence took less than 2 minutes. Of her crew of 710 men, 639 died, trapped below decks or sucked down by the vortex of the sinking vessel. Only 48 survivors were pulled from the water. De Robeck was stunned, but he pressed on. The attack had come too far to be abandoned because of a single ship. He ordered the British battleships forward to take up the French positions. The guns continued to thunder. But around 4 o'clock, disaster struck again. HMS Inflexible, the powerful battlecruiser, struck a mine in the same treacherous waters. 30 men died instantly, and the ship began taking on 1,600 tons of water. She managed to limp away, barely afloat. Minutes later, HMS Irresistible also struck a mine. Her engine room flooded, and she began drifting helplessly under Turkish fire. De Robeck ordered HMS Ocean to take the crippled ship under tow. It was now clear that something was terribly wrong. The ships were not being destroyed by the Turkish forts. They were being destroyed by mines in waters that had been swept and declared safe. De Robeck ordered a general withdrawal. But as HMS Ocean moved to assist Irresistible, she too struck a mine. Her steering jammed. She began to drift, coming under heavy fire from Turkish batteries. A shell from the legendary Turkish gunner Corporal Sayet, who had single-handedly lifted 3 215-pound shells into his gun when the loading mechanism failed, struck her starboard side. Her engine room flooded. By nightfall, both Irresistible and Ocean had sunk. 3 battleships lost, 3 more, Inflexible, Gaulois, and Suffren, severely damaged and out of action. 700 Allied sailors dead, most of them French. It was the worst single day of naval losses that Britain had suffered since the Battle of Trafalgar more than a century before. De Robeck called off the attack. He signaled the Admiralty that the fleet could not force the straits alone. A military force would be needed to capture the shore batteries. Churchill was devastated. He had staked everything on this operation, and it had failed. But here is where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable. Because on the Turkish side, the picture was entirely different. The defenders were at the end of their endurance. More than half of their artillery ammunition had been expended. The heavy guns at the Narrows had only 27 long-range shells remaining, enough for perhaps a few minutes of sustained fire. The mobile howitzer batteries were low on ammunition. The minefields at the Narrows, those 10 lines of death that the Allies had feared, were virtually intact, but the guns that protected them were falling silent. Turkish commanders watched in disbelief as the Allied fleet withdrew. They had expected the attack to resume the next morning. They were preparing for defeat. In Constantinople, the American ambassador Henry Morgenthau recorded the scene in his memoirs. The whole Ottoman state, on that 18th day of March when the Allied fleet abandoned the attack, was on the brink of dissolution. The populace, far from opposing the arrival of the Allied fleet, would have welcomed it with joy. for this would emancipate them from the hated Germans, bring about peace, and end their miseries. Morgenthau reported that Ottoman officials believed they could only hold out for a few hours if the attack resumed. A senior German Admiralty official later acknowledged, "I have no doubt whatever that Turkey would have made peace, there would have been a revolution. The appearance of ships before Constantinople would have been sufficient." Commodore Roger Keyes, de Robeck's chief of staff, would later write with anguish, "I had the almost indelible impression that we were in the presence of a beaten foe. I thought he was beaten at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I knew he was beaten at 4 o'clock, and at midnight I knew with still greater clarity that he was absolutely beaten." But Keyes was overruled. De Robeck, shaken by the day's losses, refused to renew the attack. And the Admiralty in London, though Churchill fought desperately to order the assault resumed, accepted the Admiral's judgment. The moment passed. The door that had stood open for one terrible glittering instant swung shut. German General Lyman von Sanders, who would soon take command of Ottoman forces at Gallipoli, was elated when he realized no follow-up assault was coming. He used the precious weeks that followed to reinforce the defenses, bring up fresh ammunition, and prepare for the land invasion that everyone now knew was coming. Churchill watched in helpless fury as the opportunity slipped away. He later wrote, "And yet if the Navy had tried again, they would have found that the door was open." He argued, and would argue for the rest of his life, that the old battleships were expendable, that their loss would have been a price worth paying for the prize of Constantinople. But his voice no longer carried weight. The coalition government that formed in May 1915 required his removal from the Admiralty as the price of conservative support. Fisher had resigned in a dramatic confrontation on May 15th, walking out of the Admiralty and refusing to return even when ordered to do so in the King's name. His departure triggered the political crisis that ended Churchill's first great office. On May 21st, Prime Minister Asquith wrote to Churchill with words that cut like a blade, "You must take it as settled that you are not to remain at the Admiralty." 3 days later, Churchill's tenure as First Lord formally ended. He was demoted to Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a ceremonial position with no power and no influence on the war he had helped to shape. He remained nominally on the Dardanelles Committee, watching helplessly as the campaign he had championed lurched toward catastrophe. The land assault began on April 25, 1915. 70,000 Allied troops, British, French, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and Newfoundland, stormed ashore at Cape Hell and a cove that would forever be known as Anzac Cove. For many of the 16,000 Australians and New Zealanders who landed that day, it was their first experience of combat. By nightfall, 2,000 had been killed or wounded. Turkish forces under the command of Mustafa Kemal, the man who would later become Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey, held the heights and threw back every assault. The campaign that Churchill had envisioned as a war-winning masterstroke became another exercise in futile slaughter. Month after month, the armies hurled themselves against Turkish defenses. The August offensive, including fresh landings at Suvla Bay, failed to break the deadlock. Disease, typhoid, dysentery, frostbite claimed as many lives as bullets and shells. By the time the campaign ended with a brilliantly executed evacuation in January 1916, more than 250,000 Allied soldiers had become casualties. Over 44,000 were dead. Turkish losses were even higher. Some estimates suggest 250,000 casualties, with nearly 90,000 dead. And what of Churchill? In November 1915, with the Gallipoli campaign clearly failing and his political influence reduced to nothing, he resigned from the government entirely. He asked to be sent to the front. His request for the governorship of British East Africa was rejected by Asquith. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Winston Churchill took command of the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers and went to the trenches of the Western Front. For 6 months, he served in the line near the Belgian village of Ploegstert, sharing the dangers and discomforts of the ordinary soldiers he led. He narrowly escaped death when shrapnel fell between him and his cousin. It was, in many ways, a form of penance. The fierce wartime censures of press and public fell almost exclusively upon him. Professional military men distrusted him as a politician meddling in strategy. His political enemies regarded his entanglement in the Dardanelles disaster as divine judgment on his ambition. The cry of, "What about the Dardanelles?" would follow him for decades, shouted by hecklers at political meetings, whispered in the corridors of power. One historian would later write that Gallipoli haunted Churchill for the rest of his political career. Churchill himself never wavered in his belief that the strategy had been sound. In his monumental History of the War, the World Crisis, published in the 1920s, he wrote, "Searching my heart, I cannot regret the effort." It was good to go as far as we did, not to persevere. That was the crime. He argued that success at the Dardanelles could have changed everything. It would have united the Balkans on our side. It would have saved Serbia. It would have made the Greek army of 300,000 men available against the Central Powers. It would have shortened the war. It would have spared the slaughter of the Somme and Passchendaele. The Dardanelles Commission, which investigated the campaign in 1916 and 1917, spread blame widely among the decision-makers, Asquith, Kitchener, Fisher, the admirals at the Strait. But it was Churchill who paid the price. As historian Christopher Bell concluded, Churchill alone bore the burden. Churchill would return to power as Minister of Munitions under Lloyd George in 1917, as War Secretary in 1919, and eventually as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s. But another wilderness awaited him. From 1929 to 1939, he was once again out of office, warning of dangers that few wished to hear. When war came again in September 1939, Churchill returned to the Admiralty, the post he had held when disaster struck. The signal flashed across the fleet. "Winston is back." By then, a quarter of a century had passed since those terrible days in the Dardanelles. Churchill had learned hard lessons from that failure. In his war memoirs, he reflected, "I was ruined for the time being in 1915 over the Dardanelles, and a supreme enterprise was cast away through my trying to carry out a major and cardinal operation of war from a subordinate position. Men are ill-advised to try such ventures. This lesson had sunk into my nature." The lesson would serve him well in the Second World War, when as Prime Minister he held supreme authority and could see his strategic visions through to completion. But the ghosts of the Dardanelles never entirely departed. They walked beside him through D-Day and El Alamein, through the bomber offensive and the liberation of Europe. They reminded him of the price of failure, of the fragility of fortune, of how close the line runs between triumph and disaster. And perhaps the cruelest ghost of all was this: the knowledge that on March 18, 1915, victory had been within grasp. The Turkish ammunition was nearly exhausted. The government in Constantinople was preparing to flee. The populace was ready to welcome liberation. One more push, one more day of endurance, and the door would have swung open. The fleet would have steamed through to the Sea of Marmara, appeared before the walls of Constantinople, and changed the course of history. Instead, the Allies withdrew. The campaign ground on for 10 more months of bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands died who might have lived. The Russian supply line remained closed, contributing to the collapse that would bring revolution and Bolshevism. The war dragged on for 3 more years of unprecedented slaughter. And Winston Churchill, the visionary who had seen what might be done, was cast into the wilderness, bearing the blame for a failure that was not entirely his own. Today in Turkey, March 18th is commemorated as Çanakkale Victory Day, one of the nation's most sacred anniversaries. The minelayer Nusret has been restored and stands as a monument to the defense that saved an empire. The name Gallipoli echoes through Australian and New Zealand history as the baptism of national identity, marked every April 25th on Anzac Day. And in Britain, the Dardanelles remains one of history's great tragedies, a bold strategy undone by hesitation at the moment of truth, a campaign that came tantalizingly close to success before collapsing into catastrophe. Winston Churchill understood this better than anyone. In his final letter to the Dardanelles Commission, he wrote words that ring with prophetic certainty. The passage of a few years will throw a very different light on these events. It will then seem incredible that a dozen old ships, half a dozen divisions, or a few 100,000 shells were allowed to stand between us and success. Contemporaries have condemned the men who tried to force the Dardanelles. History will condemn those who did not aid them. The judgment of history remains contested, but what is certain is this: on that 18th day of March, 1915, in the narrow waters of the Dardanelles, the world stood at a crossroads. The path taken led to Gallipoli, to the prolongation of the war, to revolution in Russia, and to consequences that still shape our world today. The path not taken The one where the Allied fleet pressed on through those last desperate hours, where the mines ran out before the will to fight, where Constantinople fell and Turkey sued for peace. That path leads only into the realm of what might have been. It is a realm that Winston Churchill inhabited for the rest of his days, a realm of ghosts and regrets and roads forever closed. And somewhere in the deep waters of the Dardanelles, 3 battleships still rest on the seafloor, silent witnesses to one of history's most fateful afternoons, guardians of a secret that the Allies discovered too late. The door had been open all along.